So the first question I was asked to breach today was, what are the kinds of scientific things that I think are beautiful and elegant? And over the last few years, I've been really interested in what makes us human, what makes life living, what's the difference between inanimate and animate matter? And there are all kinds of fascinating things if you think about the natural world. One of the things that you may know, but I found very fascinating, is how many genes we share with other organisms. So we share something like 15% of our genes with E. coli, 25% with yeast, 50% with flies, 70% with frogs. If you kiss one and it becomes a prince, then it's 100%, or at least, and 98% with chimpanzees. I actually grew up in Gabon in Central Africa. My parents were biologists. We had a lot of animals at home, including Bertje, a chimpanzee that I grew up with. And just to be absolutely clear, for those of you that can't, this is me, and that is a chimpanzee. Okay. My mother says that although we look different, we behave remarkably similarly. So the question really is, what makes us different? And one of the things that makes us different is actually not the number of genes that we have, but the way that they're connected. So one of the things I look at, you see there in that corner of the graph, is each of these is a gene, and each of those connections they're like switches. You might be under the misapprehension that genes are like blueprints, like architectural drawings, but that couldn't be further from the truth. They're much more like networks of switches, like chips. And so you can rewire them and get completely different behavior out of them. And of course, what's fun about this, if you're a physicist, is that the way that you can model these is with differential equations. And so off we go and we crank, and we're very happy for a long time. And so this is one of the things that I'm interested in. What makes biological complexity emerge from this set of interactions? Is there something that emerges from there that's different from just the underlying things? Another thing I'm very interested in my lab is that you see on this picture. This is a bacterium. Bacteria swim, and many of them swim with this little motor. This is a model from KG Numba's group of how the bacterial flagellar motor assembles. This is an incredible little piece of nanomachinery. It can spin at 100,000 RPM. It can stop in something like a quarter of a turn. If you saw something like this, and I could hold it in my hand, I'd assume it was made somewhere in a factory. Some very complex system put it together. But these things make themselves. These proteins just float around, and they somehow know exactly where to go. You may not know this, but you have 10 times as many bacteria in your body as you have cells in your body. Okay? Before you all rush off to the hospital, that's perfectly normal. They're much smaller than your cells. Your gut is full of them. In fact, you are part human, part microbe. We talk about the microbiome. You're part microbe. And so this is a very interesting thing to think about. So while I'm speaking to you today, this process that you see here will be happening millions of times in your body during this talk. And so I actually saw this movie a number of years ago, and I thought to myself, wait, how does that work? How do those particles know where to go? Clearly, nature does it all the time, but that is an absolutely staggering feat. And one of the great things about being an academic is I could then start thinking about it. And I won't lie with my own won't lie about my own superficiality. I actually got into this field because I saw a movie, and I thought, how does that work? And this is the movie that I saw. And so I'm interested in this question: how do you make things that make themselves? And also, how do you evolve things that self-assemble to make themselves? That's a really interesting and fascinating question. It's the kind of thing that I work on today. I spoke at the physics department about how these things evolve, and I want to show you a little bit more about how these things self-assemble. I sometimes tell people that what it's a bit like is like taking Lego blocks. And if I could figure out how this works, I could take Lego blocks, put them in a box, shake the box, all right, and out would come a fully formed train. In fact, as a Christian, I think that this is how God probably made the world. Did God create the world all at once? Or did he make the world through something which makes itself? Surely the latter is a much more beautiful, much more elegant, much more interesting way of thinking about the way creation is. So that's kind of a fun thing to think about. And the main thing to get away from this is that science is fun. Okay? Science is fun. It's amazing that I get paid money to think about these things. A few generations ago, I would have had to be independently wealthy to do this. But here, me, a boy from very humble Dutch Gabonese background, can sit here and get paid money. And it's people's tax money, not yours, but other people's tax money. your tax money will probably fund Max at some point. It gets paid, and it's great. And the reason for that is because we've found that many of the best discoveries come from this thinking about what we think is interesting. So science is very fun. I realize here I'm in an MIT audience, and so many of you probably are from science. And I'll tell you a few other tips about science that are helpful. So I do a lot of flying. I'm often on a plane. I just want to be quiet, either read or sleep. And you know how you have somebody next to you who starts asking you all kinds of questions, like, what do you do? Generally, if they say, what do you do? I say, I'm a theoretical physicist. That more or less kills the conversation. Exactly, that's true, it's true, right? And if that doesn't, they keep talking to me, I say, I like equations. What's your favorite equation? And so, this is probably a stereotype I would put in. I'll skip this little joke. I've solved this one, actually, happily. But, it took a lot of calculation. So let me tell you something else about equations that really struck me a lot as a young student. So I have a confession to make, which was when I was in secondary school and high school here, I was interested in the usual things: girls, football. So we have football, which is a real football, the one where you kick. Not the one that you hold in your hand. I don't know why it's called a football. I think Max will do the same, right? The real football. These are the things. But I also was interested in quantum mechanics, and I taught myself quantum mechanics in high school. And I realized I can admit that here because I'm probably certainly not the only one in the room. But then when I went to university and I started studying, I took a course, and this was one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. This is Paul Dirac, one of my great heroes, a mathematical physicist in Cambridge, who in the late 1920s was thinking about the following. So I'm sure you're familiar here with the Schrödinger equation. This is MIT. Schrödinger equation, the theory of very small things. And that had been worked out in 1926 by Erwin Schrödinger. And so Dirac was asking himself a very simple question. What if I combine the Schrödinger equation, which works for very small things, with Einstein's special relativity from 1905, very fast things? Very simple question. Take an electron. What happens when it moves close to the speed of light? Will it transform according? Will it be Lorentz? Can I write down a Lorentz invariant version of the Schrödinger equation? And what I learned in that course is something really fascinating, which is that if I try to write down a version of the Schrödinger equation that transforms according to the laws of special relativity, the only way that it works is if I need a certain kind of non-commuting algebra that only works if I have not just two components for spin up and spin down, but another component, some other object. And Dirac, in his great genius, said, well, this is what the math says, and wrote down this equation. And a few years later, the positrons, the antimatter, was discovered. And I remember, as a student, doing this derivation and thinking, that is too amazing to be true. How could the mathematical structure of two very disparate theories, when they combine together, generate something even more fantastical like antimatter? How could that demand that kind of obedience, if you wish, from the physical world? And I think these are some of the most beautiful things that there are in our worlds. Mountains are beautiful, sea is beautiful, but this is extraordinarily exquisite and extraordinarily beautiful. And I just want to tell you about that because that's something that I think is very fascinating about our world, which is what we call, Eugene Wigner, a famous Nobel Prize winner, called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. And so one of the really interesting questions when we look at the physical world is, why do we see this incredible, elegant beauty underlying it? And why can we, human beings, understand anything about that beauty? It's just one of the most striking things that there is in the world. By the way, on this Dirac equation, I was sure Dirac was wrong. I was sure that couldn't be true. I spent a whole night once trying to figure out where he'd missed something. It's a typical hubris of youth. I had to bow to the great master. And I now, over time, I realize even how great he really was compared to someone like me. But this is one of the most beautiful things in the world. And a question for all of us is, what does this mean? Does this have any meaning? Why is the world this way? Why is the world so beautiful? In fact, I often give this quote to my students from Henri Poincaré. A scientist does not study nature because it is useful. He studies it because he delights in it. And he delights in it because it is beautiful. If nature were not beautiful, it would not be worth knowing. And if nature were not worth knowing, life would not be worth living. You can see that Poincaré was a Frenchman. So there is something really exquisitely beautiful about the natural world and about the way we're able to understand it. And so this is something which has always inspired me, and I'm trying to apply these ideas, these mathematical ideas, to the living world and seeing whether I can make any progress. And that, I think, is a really worthwhile thing to devote one's life to. So my brief from the Veritas team was to give an introduction to my work, and then give a brief explanation where I think these laws of nature come from, and then on a third point to discuss how these physical laws may make me think about ethics or behavior. So I'm going to talk now about this kind of brief explanation of where those laws come from and my worldview and why I believe it. I mean, these are a lot of things to cover in 15, 20 minutes, so I will be skating over them. I think one really important thing about science is that science allows an enormous worldview plurality. So the scientists in my lab, my PhD students, have a wide range of kind of metaphysical views about the world. And as long as they hold basically to things like uniformity, the world is more or less the same everywhere, it's regular, there's not miracles when your equation doesn't converge, and intelligibility, I can understand something about the world, then they're welcome to be in my lab. And that's one of the great things about science, is enormously democratizing of all kinds of views we have about who we are and how we should live. And what's interesting is that some of these basic, what might be interesting from a Christian's point of view is not that we agree on these general laws, but the kind of meta question, where do these principles come from? Why is nature regular? Why does it follow regular laws? Why can we understand them? And we're so used to these ideas today that we don't realize that they weren't actually that obvious to most people through most time. And the reason for that is that if you just live in the natural world, it doesn't seem to be always that regular. It seems to be capricious. It changes itself all the time. And so what you can show, I think quite decisively historically, is that these ideas, these metaphysical underpinnings of science, uniformity, regularity, intelligibility, have deep theological roots. Their roots go back to a long history of theological reflection on a God who is faithful and sustains the world, therefore, in a regular way. And if you like these kind of things, there's a lot of literature on this. There's a book that I recommend by James Hanan that looks at it's how the Christian Middle Ages launched the scientific revolution. So one thing as a Christian, I think there's a very natural explanation for why we can do science. That's because if God sustains the world, and God is a God of order and a God of faithfulness, then I expect the world to follow regular laws. Some people would call this the customs of the Creator. So what I'm doing in my lab is studying the customs of the Creator, the regular ways that God sustains the world. So I think that within Christianity, there is, both historically and basically exegetically, a very strong kind of argument for why science would work and why we should do science. It fits very naturally into that worldview. But it can fit into other worldviews, and that's one of the great things about doing science. We can ask a bigger question about our kind of worldview and what does science tell us about that. But perhaps I want to do a little side question first and just say, what if I wanted to ask you, why is there something? In other words, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, there are, to first order, roughly three possibilities. Something, like our natural laws, the laws of nature, has always existed. So there's always been something. And then you can ask, well, what caused the current universe? Well, it was something before that one. And what caused the current laws of nature? Well, it was something before that. But that quickly becomes kind of something, and what caused that? What something else caused it? As long as you're working in this kind of paradigm of natural laws, then you end up with an infinite regress of causes in some way or the other. That means perhaps another option is possible. That would be the option that the laws of nature, not our universe, but the actual laws of nature themselves, popped into being out of real ontological nothingness. So there really was nothing, as opposed to nothing, not a quantum vacuum fluctuating, but nothing. And out of it popped the laws of nature. That, too, is very different from anything that we would normally think about in our scientific world. It's something outside of the categories that we are used to. A third option would be the traditional one of traditional theology, which would say the whole of space-time is dependent on a non-spatio-temporal reality, a being who cannot exist, who's normally called God. And so by the principle that the explanation of something can't lie in the thing that is being explained, to me this seems the most natural explanation for why there is something rather than nothing. And I think to myself, I just look around at the world, the incredible rich fecundity of the world, the beauty of the world, and it seems very hard for me to believe that that could simply have popped into being out of ontological nothingness or just be something of an infinite regress of causes. It seems to make a lot more sense that this would, by the principal explanation, come from a being who cannot not exist, something who is outside of space and time. So that is a very brief argument to where I think those laws come from. And the last thing I was going to look at is how do those sources of physical laws, how do they help me with ethical choices? So this is where I think science doesn't help me that much. And I think it's a mistake, and actually a dangerous mistake, to think that science can ground our ethics. Science can help us making ethical decisions, but it can't ground them in any way. And so I'll give you one trivial example. What if I wanted to measure the value of a human life? That's a tremendously important question, very important question, for all kinds of practical ways that we govern ourselves and that we live. Well, I'll be a bit facetious. How would I measure the value of a human life? Well, if I was a chemist, I could measure the value of the elements, but surely somebody with gold fillings isn't worth more than somebody without them. If I was a physiologist, I could measure the size of your brain, a psychologist, how smart you are, an anthropologist, how the community values you, an economist, how much economic value you produce, homo economicus. I sometimes feel like I'm measured that way by my superiors. But we all recognize that those are the wrong axes on which to measure the value of the human being. This really important question of do humans have value and how should we value them has to come from somewhere else. And very briefly, the way I like to think about it is this. It's a bit like you're walking on a dark street and there's a very bright light that shines down. And that bright light is the light of science. The great power of science is the ability to really, in this incredible tractor beam-like way, focus on certain types of problems. But there are only certain types of problems that are amenable to the scientific method. Science's great success comes precisely from self-imposed limits. And the idea that you could only find truth where the light is a little bit like a drunk looking for his keys who only looks into the light because that's the only place where he can find them. The fact is that the really important questions of life, the questions of meaning, the questions of purpose, the questions of human value, come from the shadows, if you wish. That's where we should look. There aren't kind of scientific methods that we can use to independently adjudicate for everybody where they are. But we have no choice but to go there and to look as carefully and as carefully as we can. And so my last few minutes, that's a very quick summary of a lot of ideas, I realize, so if I have questions and answers afterwards. So how would I go about then looking at adjudicating about where to ground these questions of purpose and value? I already told you that I'm a Christian. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I believe the classic creeds of the church. I think they're actually really true. And so I think that the point in all these kinds of arguments is that that the best way of going about them is the following. So the best way of looking at the evidence. The problem often with debate is not the evidence, but how to weigh the evidence. And the best way to weigh the evidence is to start from one of two possible starting points. One is that in the beginning, there's a God who created the world, and then look at the world and think, does it resonate better with that assumption, or the alternative assumption, in the beginning, nothing. Either it came out of ontological nothingness, or there's some kind of something that preceded it. And I think that starting from the assumption that there is a God makes a lot more sense of where the world is, if you ask me. I think it explains in a natural way the basis for modern science, for why we see such beauty and fecundity in the natural world. I think it helps ground really important questions, moral questions. It grounds a kind of moral realism in a way I think is very important. I think it grounds questions of human dignity and value in ways that are absolutely critical. And I think that if I start from the assumption there is no God and then look at the world, then for me, that tapestry that it puts together, the whole, not just each part separately, is for me a lot less satisfying. I think this idea that there's a God behind the world makes the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics something that much more natural than if the world just popped into being out of nothing. Why would that be true? Why would we understand it? Why would the world even be mathematical? Obviously, all of these arguments are really just very generic arguments for theism. And you might think, well, that's fine, but which God should I choose? And I think that is a different question for a different time, but an incredibly important one. Because I think what you can't do is kind of sit on the fence and say, well, I don't really know, and so I'm not going to care. You have to make a choice, either one way or the other, because these questions are so important. They really matter to how we live our lives. They matter to questions of purpose and meaning. And so, just very briefly in the last minute, why do I believe particularly in Christianity? Well, there are many arguments for it. One is that, if there is a God, it would not be at all be surprising that this God would want to communicate with us. And so finding some kind of revelation is something that one might look for. And in the case of Christianity, there's the Bible, which I think is a really remarkable book. And for me, it has had an incredible impact on my life. And I think it points towards the kinds of truths that are deep and powerful. There's a resurrection of Jesus Christ, the life and teaching of Jesus Christ, which I think have exactly that kind of unexpected character, and once you find it seems something very deep and powerful. Just like when you first do look at Dirac's theorem, you think that has this completely unexpected, Dirac's derivation, unexpected, but deeply beautiful, non-intuitive, but powerful truth to it. In this way, also, I see this in the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. And of course, things like religious experience are really important. And all these things weave together into a tapestry for why I believe in Christianity, and in particular why I'm a follower of Jesus. I've skated over a lot of things. I just want to conclude to say science and religion really, I think, are cousinly disciplines. They're open-minded searches for motivated belief. And for me, Christianity is both intellectually robust and existentially satisfying. And I'm throwing those things out there in the hope of stimulating some later conversation. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.